Okay, hi guys, Kieran here from the Dublin Academy of Education. Welcome back. So this is the final lesson on the poetry of Adrienne Rich. So I'm just going to wrap up by referencing back to the second poem on the list here, The Uncle Speaks in the Drawing Room. So as I said, I've dealt with these slightly out of sequence just to kind of facilitate the pairing. So this poem is kind of a stepping back, and it's, you know, in terms of looking at it this way, it also gives us a good indicator, I suppose, of how much Adrienne Rich's style changed, you know, so springboarding off from A Survivor, which I was talking about in our last lesson. Looking back at The Uncle Speaks in the Drawing Room now, you can really see the much more conventional poetic style. So we're going to be on page 87 here. Again, just a couple of words, I suppose, about the backdrop to this. Again, the uncle, the definite article there is interesting. It's not an uncle, it's a specific, but it is not actually referencing anybody in particular. It is a sort of a fictional scenario that Rich outlines here. And essentially, the effect of this poem, this is one of her poems which is really about power. And it's about power, but it's about power and privilege and inherited wealth. And in many respects, with the way the narrative is sort of being shaped, as was a moment around wealth inequality on a global scale, in many respects, this poem has never been maybe more topical. The idea of disparity of wealth, the idea of a large disenfranchised group of unhappy people, and the wealthy, the elite kind of hoarding the wealth and protecting it and passing it down generation to generation. So it's you know, while the scenario here seems somewhat historically specific, it actually has universal significance. So there is again a metaphor really that underlies this poem, and this idea of the uncle sort of speaking in the drawing room is really just to kind of highlight those particular issues. So this is very much about power and about wealth. Just a word on the title, apart from saying the uncle speaks, there's also the association we have with the drawing room, and immediately suggested is wealth, and is one of these grand old houses which actually has a drawing room, and where the uncle can stand there addressing the room. So that image of, and a good word actually to use here as well as privilege, is opulence. And I think we came across this already with the storm warnings, but again reuse it here. Opulence, privilege. You know, these images of wealth suggested immediately by the title. So the other thing that's noteworthy about this poem is that Rich adopts a persona. And the persona, if you remember, is when you adopt the personality, the traits, the voice, as a poet does, of somebody who's not you. So she's actually taking on the voice of the uncle in this poem. The uncle speaks in the drawing room. I have seen the mob of late, standing sullen in the square, gazing with a sullen stare at window, balcony and gate. Some have talked in bitter tones, some have held and fingered stones. These are follies that subside. Let us consider nonetheless certain frailties of glass, which, it cannot be denied, lead in times like these to fear for crystal vase and chandelier. Not that the missiles will be cast. None as yet dare lift an arm, but the scene recalls a storm when our grandsire stood aghast to see his antique ruby bowl shivered in a thunder roll. Let us only bear in mind how these treasures handed down from a calmer age passed on are in the keeping of our kind. We stand between the dead glass blowers and murmurings of missile throwers. Apologies if I started to sort of adopt a strange sort of a persona there myself, but I think that this voice in this poem, it lends itself to that. Immediately this tone of arrogance sort of and superiority emerges from this character. So that's critical as well to understanding the point maybe that Rich is trying to make here. So the I immediately establishes that persona in the first line. The way he says the mob, take note of that, it's quite dismissive. See the mob, you know, the great unwashed, that group, sort of this idea of the superiority. I've seen them of late standing sullen in the square, gazing with a sullen stare. Again, note the repetition of those two words there, the idea of sullen, and what that implies, you know, that they are sulking or that they are somehow disgruntled. But you'll notice that there's no real attempt as the poem progresses to understand why this mob, why these people might be unhappy, why they might be sullen. That exploration, that reflection is not forthcoming from the uncle, which is, again, significant when we consider I suppose, the attitudes traditionally of the wealthy towards maybe those who have less. Window, balcony, and gate, highlight that. Again, just in those 3 words, capturing this image again of wealth. Just, straight away we see this vision of a grand house with a balcony, a gate, window, that sort of thing. So again, establishing, I suppose, the setting here. And the images then of unrest, the mob talking in bitter tones, holding and fingering stones. So the images of unrest, unhappiness, and what this does contribute to is a slightly threatening atmosphere. And again, I mentioned about the atmospheric quality to many of her poems, and this idea of something brewing. But again, unlike storm warnings and so on, here, and this is where it's a different exploration of power and control. That as much as this mob might be kind of trying to maybe bolster some kind of rebellion, some kind of maybe revolution against the wealthy. Really, as this poem progresses, we see that that's never really going to become a reality. So it's a different exploration of that theme. In the second stanza, note, these are follies that subside. The word follies means kind of foolishness or silliness that subside. It's a direct statement. Notice the placement of the full stop here. So it's a direct and a confident statement, again, dismissing any kind of disgruntlement that this mob might feel. Straight away, just a dismissal of their concerns, and it'll subside, it'll go away. We don't have to worry about this nonsense. Let us consider nonetheless. So now we start to focus on what this uncle, representing the wealthy in general, I suppose, is really concerned about. Certain frailties of glass. So highlight that. The idea of precious ornaments, fragile ornaments, that kind of thing. But the universal way of looking at that is it's really more to do with materialism. Materialism, material objects, protecting that which we have inherited, and those items of material value. It cannot be denied, and again, so highlight these lines to kind of reinforce that idea. Lead in times like these to fear for crystal vase and chandelier. So this idea of, the only thing I'm concerned about is that it's never any sense that the uncle is worried about, having his power taken from him, or that this mob would be in any way successful in terms of overthrowing. But rather, we might need to keep an eye out on sort of, our material possessions, and then recalls sort of this memory in the third stanza then of a grandsire, as he says, sort of an ancestor. But even the word grandsire is kind of pretentious as well. Our grandsire, how he stood aghast to see his antique ruby bowl shivered in a thunder roll. So again, that's reinforcing that same idea but even the idea that the antique ruby bowl simply shivered. So there wasn't even any lasting damage, but rather that, the last time sort of some story was passed on from 2 generations earlier about, some mob starting to rise up, and his grandsire telling this story of how the ruby bowl almost broke, kind of thing. So again, it's all metaphorical and sort of symbolic here, representing really the idea of what the wealthy are protecting, I suppose, and what they prioritize, and the complete dismissal of the concerns of ordinary people. The word aghast is actually worth noting in there as well, because it's almost a comical image. To be aghast is like the face sort of stretched in comic mock horror. So there may be a tone here, sort of mockery of the wealthy in a kind of subversive way as well. Do note at the beginning of that stanza too, sorry, I'm backtracking slightly here, but just to connect those 2 ideas, but the confidence again at the beginning of that third stanza, not that the missiles will be cast, none as yet dare lift an arm. Again, the arrogance, they won't do this. So it's this concept of, well, we worry about superficial damage, but they will never really rise up against us. So it's an interesting sort of a confidence that this character has, which again is in keeping with the point that Rich is making. The final stanza then, let us only bear in mind how these treasures handed down from a calmer age passed on are in the keeping of our kind. Now this is where this idea of these treasures and these material possessions becomes more metaphorical, and really becomes about inheritance and about privilege and about inherited wealth and about generational wealth being passed on down. And note those lines: treasures handed down from a calmer age passed on are in the keeping of our kind. And even note there that our kind, how the uncle draws a clear distinction here between who he believes, what he represents, the people that he's kind of addressing in this drawing room, in this imaginary. There's our kind and there's their kind. So again, it's this idea that he's somehow better, different, and superior, and really we just have to, be careful with the mob and just keep them away and so on. Captured as well nicely in those last two lines: we stand between the dead glass blowers, if you like, those who created sort of the wealth and so on, and the murmurings of missile throwers, and the alliteration there sort of, and even that word murmuring, the idea that they're sort of conspiring in some way, these missile throwers, and that the missile throwers then come to represent in some metaphorical way, those who would seek to take from the wealthy and to take this inheritance and this sense of privilege. And the way the poem ends then is very much a reflection of that conservative 1950s America, where, and this idea of change and the lack of change, and how the uncle sort of personifies, and this is why Rich is really using this persona, he really personifies this character who is privileged, who doesn't regard the concerns of the mob, of those outside, as being of any real concern, and that really is just concerned with just protecting what they have and keeping that safe from their kind. And that is, in a sense, the essence of conservatism, those who would not see change occur. And if you're in a position of privilege, in a position of power, in a position, where you have all the wealth accumulated, why would you want to see change? And that's why conservatives tend to maybe occupy a particular space in any social structure, usually one of relative privilege. So this character, the uncle, he is interesting. And I think it's a thought-provoking poem in an interesting way that Rich uses to explore this idea. So it is certainly one, I think, that if we talk about power, this could certainly kind of pair up with Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. I like putting it with Storm Warnings, because I think this idea of power, powerlessness, the idea of something coming, the idea of those like Rich who live in, as she says, troubled regions, and then there's kind of the uncle who doesn't necessarily, he may live in a slightly troubled region, but his, that level of control and power is it's completely different. So it's just these explorations of what we can and cannot control, and the conservatism as an idea in and of itself. And just one final point to note about this poem as well is the rhythm, the regular rhyme scheme and the regular rhythm here, which actually, communicates this sense of confidence, this sense of certainty in this uncle's voice. I have seen the mob of late, standing sullen in the square, gazing with a sullen stare at window, balcony, and gate. So the rhyming scheme and the regular rhythm all projects this sense of confidence. So those are the 6 poems that I'm going to look at and sort of leave it at that. There is one other one that I just want to reference very, very quickly before I start talking about the 2 personal responses, and just a quick word on those. So the poem is the Roof Walker. So if you go back, just need to find it here. It is about halfway through here. Before that one, so on page 93 here. I'm not going to look at this in any great detail. The Roof Walker, it's a reference to male builders. Again, this is another metaphorical poem. And the scenario that Rich is setting up in this poem is as the poet looking out the window, seeing these male construction workers up on the roofs. The roof walkers is kind of a slang term that was used for them in Rich's time. And it becomes then a metaphor for a woman trying to break into sort of the male-dominated world of poetry, in the sense that I suppose the construction industry, and particularly these roof walkers, this job was high risk, but it was also male-dominated. So it's kind of the way that Rich is seeing it. But the line that I really like, there's 2 lines I'd just like you to take out of this poem. So if you skim down through it, just at line 13 and 14, I feel like them up there exposed. That's a great line in terms of the confessional, sort of honest nature again of Rich's poetry, and of her experiencing trying to break into this male-dominated world. But I think most significant, and probably my favorite line, in a Rich poem at line 22, a life I didn't choose chose me. So highlight that line. It's just at line 22 on page 93. When I talk about structuring personal responses, when we talk about including the hook, that's a great line. I think in many respects that defines Rich to a large extent, that this reconciliation of things that were outside of her control, that life in a sense she didn't make these choices, that this was just the choices that were presented to her. This life chose her, so all she had to do and all she could do was respond, and for better or worse, move through her journey. So we're just going to again talk just for the next few minutes, the conclusion of this class here about personal responses, what you should be focusing on, how to structure them. Again, emphasizing at all times, do not summarize the poems. That is not the task. You identify the elements of the question, you say, what am I being asked here? And then you plan and you structure your response accordingly. So this one here is from 2012. That was, I think, I think it was the last time that we had Rich on the course. And then I've just thrown up another one here, which is from 2010, 2 years earlier. 2 responses. So again, hopefully you're working away on your Boland responses at the moment. So once those are done, again, this is how you consolidate this. This is how you sit down, use these notes, use these lessons, pick out the parts of the particular poems that work for you, and then think about what your potential points would be. So remember, your personal response, you're thinking in and around 800 words, 4 pages on average. You're thinking about making 4 to 5 central points. You reference a minimum of 4 poems within the personal response, and you structure it as a standard discursive essay. Introduction, main body paragraphs, each paragraph dealing with a separate idea, and then your concluding paragraph at the end. Now, first thing, again, you have to identify the elements of the question, and you got to think about the codes. And when we're prepping the personal responses, this is what you need to do. So, first one here, Rich's poetry communicates powerful feelings. So communicating powerful feelings through thought-provoking images and symbols. The codes for this one, PF for the powerful feelings, and then IS for any focus here on thought-provoking imagery and symbolism. So what do you have to do? You got to step back from this. And what you don't do is just tear into it and just start writing about, this poem, this poem, this poem, this poem. You look at these 6 that we've discussed and you go, right, okay, which ones would support the points I'm trying to make? What response am I going to make? And does she, and remember again, there is the discursive element that's available to you here. Does she always discuss powerful feelings? Does she always communicate these powerful feelings in thought-provoking images and symbols? Now again, you can allow the response to guide you and think about that, but what you need to start by asking yourself is, what feelings does she communicate? That's part 1. And by extension then, are they powerful? Now, how do I determine? This is where your discussion comes in. What kind of power do these feelings, what sort of powerful feelings? Again, that will open it up to a little more discussion. And then, what images, symbols does she use? And again, and this is again where the potential to discuss this comes in. Excuse me. Are they thought-provoking? Maybe they're not. Maybe they didn't provoke any thought in you at all. Again, generally, you'll stretch to try and find some way, because again, we want to be positive in our personal responses. We want to embrace the poetry. We want to embrace, I suppose, the opportunity here to look at somebody else's art and consider what that means. And yes, I think that it's fair to say that a huge number of the images and symbols in there are quite thought-provoking. But again, it is a personal response. You make it about you. You find out what was thought-provoking for you, what images and symbols might you discuss, and how then they communicate those feelings. So again, this is why we don't summarize the poems, because the focus here is very particular. It's on images and symbols. So that's where we have to really, that needs to be our starting point. What are my images and symbols? What are my feelings? What is the connection between these two elements? So when you're planning for this, you're working down through the poems, again, there'll probably be 3 or 4 ideas that come immediately to mind. So when you start to sort of brainstorm these and think, okay, well, what images come to mind? And again, you split the page. Think about the feelings, think about the images and symbols. What feelings do I see in Rich's poetry? What feelings are emerging from this? So, the feeling, even the ideas of that the characters in some of her poems, communicating powerful feelings, like the feeling maybe of fear that Aunt Jennifer's tigers, that feeling that Aunt Jennifer has, the idea of the massive weight of the uncle's wedding bed, the ringed by ordeals, the terrified hands in the coffin. We think about feelings in storm warnings, for example, the feeling maybe of foreboding, the feeling of threat, the feeling of the onset of something. From a survivor, great one. We're talking about, this is one of the most emotive poems in many respects, the feelings of regret, the feelings of sadness, but also, as I said, notably maybe the absence of the feeling of guilt or the feeling of a sense of responsibility in that sense, rather just focusing on the tragic element of it all. Trying to talk with a man, maybe the feelings of not fear is different to that, but sort of the feelings of maybe trepidation, the feelings of slight anxiety. Certainly that great image of the deformed, the river forcing its way through the deformed cliffs, the underground river. So that idea of a sort of oppression or being suppressed by something. So there's a lot of different feelings that are emerging in different poems. So what I want to look at is the connection between those powerful feelings and the images and symbols. So then we look at the second person response here. Again, we got the two elements. Adrienne Rich explores the twin themes of power and powerlessness in a variety of interesting ways. So again, we'll probably be coding this something like the P for the power and the powerlessness, and then of interesting ways, V maybe for the variety of interesting ways. That is a classic of maybe the slightly older style person responses, from 10 years ago and so on, which were a little broader, a little bit more, give you a little bit more wriggle room and so on. This one is obviously slightly more specific, but the specific nature of this is, well, the idea that you're restricted to some extent with the thematic focus, and here it's on power. But look, guys, even thinking about this, looking at the poems we looked at, is there a poem there that doesn't in some way, shape or form explore the idea of power or powerlessness or control or something, whether it's the ability to control yourself, whether it's control and dynamics within a relationship, whether it's like in the Uncle Speaks in the Drawing Room, something more societal and something more historic, and power being used in those ways. Like, there are loads and loads of different examples from across the board. So again, we're thinking about exploring the twin themes of power and powerlessness. So where is power evident, or power dynamics? Which poems do you really look at? What power, or like where is powerlessness explored? Where am I seeing characters who are powerless, like maybe Aunt Jennifer within her poems, who very much lacks power, and why, and how do I develop that discussion a bit? And then how are these explored in interesting ways? And the interesting ways is the part of this that you should be delighted about, because when you see that, you're saying, oh, this is great, because I can kind of use anything. Because when you're talking about interesting ways, you're simply thinking about this as a euphemism for techniques, poetic techniques. So again, back to our theme, tone, and techniques. So the techniques, the pattern, the imagery, the sensuousness, the suggestion. Interesting ways, anything. Using the persona. So we're talking about, again, the marriage between the style, the way the poems are written, and the exploration of the themes. So if she's discussing this theme of power, of powerlessness, and even just calling them twin themes, in a sense, that's part of a bigger picture. That can almost be a distraction within that question, because really that's kind of dealing with the same thing. If you're dealing with power, then by virtue of the fact that you're looking at power, you're going to be looking at powerlessness as well, because those dynamics exist. So don't be distracted by that. Just think anything around power, around control, around that whole area, and what is interesting. So as I was just about to say, that the persona of the uncle, for example, there's an interesting way that she explores power, the power of inherited wealth, of the privilege. So again, just pick that one thing, and this is Again, this is key to structuring your personal response, guys. Every paragraph should be dealing with a particular distinctive element, and make sure that you signpost this so that you bring it all back in. So when you're dealing with a response like this, you say, okay, first thing I want to see is like what is the poem that you're going to focus on just to support this point? Where is the power exercised in the poem? Who is exercising power over it? Where is this theme emerging? And then very, very explicitly identifying the interesting way, or potentially it could be more, you could be discussing more, but don't take on too much here. Try and keep it simple. Try and think, okay, what is, like, where's the power in the poem in terms of the focus on the theme? What is the interesting way in which that is explored? As I said, just like the example of the uncle and the persona, like think about the techniques. That's right. So the use of the persona there is an interesting way to explore inherited wealth. Think about, say, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, like the image of the wedding band, that symbol. So that's your technique, that's your interesting way. The symbol of the wedding band as a massive weight, as a kind of a symbol of control that the husband has over the wife in the marriage, and a kind of a symbol of, and how connected with the image of her, her hands, the ordeals being ringed by this and so on. So again, your starting point, got to step back from, identify what are the elements of the question, have a little brainstorm for yourself, line up your ideas. Introduction, 4 or 5 major points. You decide, you have to determine this based on how well you can develop these discussions. Ideally, I suppose it'd probably be with 4 within the response, and then tie it off with the conclusion. Remember, for your introduction, what we want to see is a hook, rather than just saying, yes, I strongly agree that Richard's poetry. No, don't do that, guys. I've said this to you so many times. Make something, as you pick a quotation there. Adrienne Rich once said, "A life I didn't choose chose me." Something like that. Just, and something that addresses the idea, because that would be a great one when we're talking about power and powerlessness, and the idea that, we don't have a lot of these choices, that choices aren't ours to make, aren't always ours to make, and so on. So think about your hook. Think about your main thesis. Then, do you or do you not? To what extent? Remember, to what extent do you agree? Do you disagree? Outline that. Maybe outline 1 or 2 of the poems then that you're going to discuss, and the major points that you're going to make, or just range, from poems like "And Jennifer's Tigers" to "From a Survivor." She certainly explores this theme in a variety of interesting ways. Again, a nice opening that introduces you, that establishes your voice and your take on the question, on the task, but without being too pedestrian. Okay, so have fun with that, guys. If you have any questions, you have my email. I would suggest that, by the end of this unit, that you attempt the personal response. You can email that in to me, looking for any other clarity or feedback or anything else like that. And failing that, give Liz a call at the desk. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, guys.